Happy Hanukkah! This year, Judaism Unbound is partnering with our friends, the Torah Studio, on a new way of celebrating Hanukkah called Apocryphest, Hanukkah Unbound and Uncanonized. We believe that Hanukkah can be a time of year where we connect to many books that were not officially included in the Hebrew Bible, but which nonetheless can be meaningful for Jewish individuals, communities, and the world. Through 5 bonus episodes, we will be exploring some of these books in detail and asking big questions about what canon even means. Liana Wertman, founder of the Torah Studio, which is an accessible and inclusive learning space that encourages people to take ownership of our traditional Jewish texts, and a past partner with us on live streaming events exploring books from Esther to Lamentations to Ecclesiastes to Ruth, joins us for all 5 of these bonus conversations. Learn more and sign up for our Apocryphest email list by visiting judaismunbound.com/apocrypha. APOCRYPHA. This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound, Hanukkah 2022, number 3, Jubilees.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg, and we are here in our 3rd bonus mini bonus episode. I don't know which adjective is modifying which, but this is a shorter and extra wonderful episode of Judaism Unbound, our 3rd in our Apocrypha Hanukkah series. And today we're diving into a book that I never can stop talking about. And if you're a really deep-cut listener of Judaism Unbound, you know that. We're diving into the book of Jubilees. And I'm excited to do that for a few reasons. One, our first couple episodes, especially our most recent one in this Hanukkah miniseries, we talked about books that are very obviously connected to Hanukkah. Jubilees is not. Jubilees is a book that, in short, it is a new version, a recrafted version of the book of Genesis. It takes all the stories from the creation of the world through Noah and the flood, through Abraham, Sarah, Rebecca, Isaac, Jacob, Leah, the whole team, through Joseph. It's a parallel version of all of those stories, but certain key things changed to fit what the author wanted to fit. And also, interestingly, a bunch of characters added. A lot more women's names are mentioned in Jubilees than in Genesis, especially in the genealogies. We hear all the generations from Adam to Noah, and then from Noah to Abraham. We learn the names of all the wives of the men who do all that begatting that people love to quote as begatting. Anyway, Jubilees is cool, and it's especially chutzpahdik. It's, let's take the most central book, the literal creation of the world, and say, some of it's wrong. We should change it. It wasn't God commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. It was actually a demon named Mastema. Like little stuff like that drastically shifts the story. And so I kind of wanted to open up the floor to either of you, Liana and Dan. Like, for me, it's really meaningful that somebody decided that literally Genesis, the top of the pyramid, the first book in Jewish tradition, we can play with that one. Like, to me, that sends a big message. And I'm curious if Jubilees lands on you similarly, or if you have a different angle on it.
One of the things you haven't mentioned yet is also the way it starts, right? It starts by setting up the book of Genesis as a story that God and an angel of God are telling to Moses to link the story of Genesis more explicitly to the rest of the books. And they keep that up throughout the story. And I'll admit, I am not as deeply read into it as you, haven't spent as much time with it as you, but just in a first read, I was so aware of the implications for and the Israelites will keep Shabbat. And this is putting the laws that we really read in Leviticus and Deuteronomy into the Genesis story. And I actually took a different mindset to it than chutzpahdik, and that they had the audacity to kind of change the story, and more this feeling of the questions that we have been asking about this book are eternal Jewish questions, right? One of the things that struck me right off the bat, I was like, okay, they have the first version of Genesis. It's the same as chapter 1 of Genesis, where there are the 7 days of creation and Shabbat. So how are they going to do the second version of the creation story? And they fix something that always bothers me, and I think bothers anyone who's reading it, is they're like, no. Adam was only naming the animals the second week. This wasn't a retelling of the first week where all of a sudden there's no life around and Adam hasn't had a wife yet. And they do keep that part. But there is this feeling that they need to make those two stories make more sense together than our canonized version does. And it follows up with like time. I think that's something that struck me is how interested they are in time. And that's why they call it the Book of Jubilees, is they're counting everything in years of 7. And so we're no longer looking at an Adam and Eve that were getting kicked out of the garden a week later. They're getting kicked out 7 years later. They've lived a real life there. And I think the time that it chooses to give us, where it's like, oh, this was a Jubilee, on a Jubilee year is when Isaac was weaned. That kind of timing really also grounds the story in a way that I felt was really just cool and exciting to read. But I didn't take it as chutzpahdik. I just took it as an oral version of our stories, that like the questions we're asking are written into the story.
I totally agree that the author probably didn't conceive of themselves, I don't know, as writing something particularly audacious. I think for them, yeah, there's this set of teachings, Torah, whatever, and I don't even know if from their perspective they were changing that much. I think from their perspective, this was their version. And it's like the story your family shares and tells at Thanksgiving, and then you tell it the next Thanksgiving, and like, did mom sort of add some stuff? Yeah, I don't know if that was there the first time. Like, does anybody care? Like, no. And then you tell it that way enough times, and that kind of becomes the real story. Like, I feel like that's what was happening. And part of the magic is that stuff we perceive as chutzpahdik, stuff that seems like, oh my gosh, they changed Genesis. For their time, it would have just been, yeah, that's like, there's different ways that people tell the stories. It's mostly oral. This is ours. What you said about connecting back themes from other books of the Torah to Genesis itself, I think it's so powerful. And I really hadn't thought of it so crystal clear before. So it is a theme, like holidays come up in Jubilees. In Genesis, you don't hear about Passover. You don't hear about Sukkot. Like, why would you? Those don't exist yet. Those are holidays that commemorate stuff that happens in Egypt a ton of generations later. Like, how would they come up in Genesis, which is the prehistory? But in Jubilees, all of a sudden, the day that Abraham sacrificed Isaac, or was going to sacrifice Isaac, that's Passover. Surprise. And that's on purpose, because the author clearly wants to build a sense of like eternalness. It's not just that, there's this group of people a bunch later, like they're tied to the origin story of the world. They want you to notice, first day of the 7th month. That's this important holiday in later books of the Bible. It's Rosh Hashanah now. In the Bible, it's called Yom Teruah, but put it aside. Like, it matters to Jewish history what Noah, who wasn't even Jewish, like Noah is pre-Jewish, but events of his story tie to Jewish holidays.
But I think there's even a different possibility, which is that, and I don't want to suggest, I'm not suggesting that Jubilees was written before Genesis, but I would suggest that perhaps the material that made up Jubilees, some of it, is more ancient than the material that made up Genesis. And the holidays are a good example, because I think that if we look at the holidays in the book of Exodus, we actually see that they're tied to the harvest solely. And there's no calendar. It's just like, look around you. When the wheat is almost ripe, that's the time for Passover. But that suggests that actually the true origins of these holidays are not these things like that you said, Lex, happened hundreds of years later in Egypt. The true origins of the holidays are what was going on in the land. So, of course, it's also not the case that they really commemorate the sacrifice of Isaac or when Noah's Ark hit the mountain or whatever. But it's not clear that those alternative commemorations are less authoritative or less to be thought of seriously as the ones that we have in the Bible. And I think that that's one of the pieces about the Apocrypha that is interesting to imagine, that it's not that they thought that it was chutzpahdik or not because it was retelling Genesis. It was that Genesis didn't exist as a sacred book at that time. That doesn't mean Genesis didn't exist at all, but Genesis was like a book in the library, and they're like, and here's another book in the library. And I don't know what the contemporary version of that may be, But it feels like, imagine that you have 5 different tellings of a certain story, and then later one of those becomes sacred. And then people forget that that all happened. Hundreds of years later, one of these other books, which was just parallel, it was just as sacred or not sacred as any other, is rediscovered. And people are like, oh, what a chutzpahdik thing to do to rewrite this story. But actually, that story was kind of just as legitimate as the other. And I think that that's one way for us to explore the Apocrypha and just some of these kinds of ideas.
In my classes where I'm teaching Torah, or just when I've been learning Torah, every once in a while, someone will either be like, well, where is this story that I've heard, right? I thought God didn't told the angels not to get excited that the Egyptians died. Or I thought Abraham destroyed all of the idols. And other times people will bring in midrash, these stories that we've been told that add to Torah. And they'll tell me their interpretations of the text we're reading. And they'll bring those stories in, fully believing that those are absolutely canonized parts of Torah. Because midrash, the stories that the rabbis wrote around these stories, are oral Torah that have continued to matter to us. And when I read this, I felt like I was reading one of those commentaries by some of the people that I learn with, which is, what would it look like to fill in the gaps in the stories with the oral stories that we have been telling around them for a long time? And my instinct around, if I think that this was ancient or one version of Genesis, is more that maybe we had tons of versions where lots of different midrash had bigger holds than others, right? We don't see the demon prince in that many midrash about the sacrifice of Isaac, though there is a version that I read recently where they say that Satan bet God that Abraham would do it. I see it more as this is a version that didn't take out the midrash yet, but really understood the midrash as an essential part of the story in a way that we also do. We just haven't written it into the story. And I'm intrigued by the choices, right, that this one book makes about which midrash really matter.
Okay, so I am so glad you brought up that story of Abraham destroying his father's idols. I mean, you mentioned the way in which we've learned that God was upset that the Egyptians died in crossing the sea and not to rejoice too much. The story of Abraham destroying his father's idols. But what's really cool is Jubilees is a specific window into one of those, the destroying the idols thing that Abraham does. If I were a few years ago to talk about that story, I mean, many people think that story of Abraham destroying his father's idols is right there in the text of Genesis. It actually isn't. It's from the Talmud. It comes much later. What I didn't know is that there's reason to believe it didn't really originate just in the Talmud, which the first part of the Talmud is sort of the around 200 of the Common Era. The full Talmud isn't quite finished till 600 of the Common Era. Jubilees, going back to the book we're talking about in this episode, there's a thing in there about how Abraham rebels against his father Terach's idols. And what's funny is Terach actually seems to agree. It's not like a big fight. Terach's like, yeah, I know these idols aren't really powerful and it's silly to worship them. But all these people around me, it's kind of like a peer pressure situation. And if I don't follow along with worshiping these gods, then I'm going to face consequences. But Abraham is the one who doesn't care and literally goes to this temple and burns all the idols. So we have this story. Jubilees is written around in the 2nd century BCE. So many hundreds of years before the Talmud comes together. I mean, saying that the idea of Abraham destroying his father's idols only originates in the Talmud, it's actually missing the point. It points to what Dan was saying, which is some of these stories, some of these ideas are really old. And Jubilees is a way for us to get a little window into those, one of the parallel 5 versions you were talking about, Dan. This is right there. And there's other situations in the book of Jubilees where we get a kernel of a later Jewish teaching that most of us are told, that's from rabbinic tradition. But Jubilees isn't a rabbinic tradition. It's much before that. So we've actually given credit to the rabbis for inventing a bunch of new stories, new drashes, new ideas, when there's plenty of reason to believe that it was earlier groups of Jews that we've marginalized, that we've decanonized, that we've not counted, who came up with some of these. So, and by the way, it's not that Jubilees necessarily invented the idea that Abraham destroyed his father's idols. For all we know, it's even before that. And we just lost the versions of the story that predate Jubilees. But we can say that at the very least, it goes back like a William Shakespeare's lifetime before we thought it was, 500 years longer back than we thought this story was. And when I say William Shakespeare's, like the difference between when William Shakespeare is alive and now, it would be as if we said, like, we today wrote Romeo and Juliet, which is, of course, wrong. But in many ways, we might be telling the story of certain Jewish narratives, like Abraham destroying his father's idols and many others, incorrectly. And Jubilees and many other books of Apocrypha are a way to sort of right that wrong, or at least get a fuller story.
I think Jubilees is as powerful as it is because we also have the canonized version of Genesis. And one of the things that these Apocrypha that we've been talking about do is give us another version that allows us to put our version or our more canonized versions into context, right? If the book of Jubilees was the canonized version of Genesis, and then someone handed me the what we understand to be Genesis version, I'd be like, wow, look at how much space they were leaving us to make decisions about what our ancestors did. There's so much more room for how they were, how they acted that wasn't allowed when we had all the answers in it. And it just is really cool to have these books that allow us to really see our canon and also our relationship to the canon in new lights because of what they've added and what they're missing.
Yeah. And that's a great note to close things out on. One final thing I wanted to say about Jubilees is it is important in any conversation about Jubilees to say that the only reason that anybody has access to this text today is that Ethiopian communities, both the Beta Israel, who are Ethiopian and Jewish, and Ethiopian Christians. Those are the communities that have preserved Jubilees. We do not have the original. We have little fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the expansive fullness of Jubilees we only have in the language of Ge'ez, which is an Ethiopic sacred language. For those of us who are not Beta Israel descended, for those of us who are a different kind of Jewish, there is a pathway of Jewish meaning making that only exists to us because of that group. And so it's not so much that we need to be like, oh my gosh, thank you. I mean, I do think we should be really grateful that that's the case. This book, Jubilees, has been really meaningful in my life and helped me think about Judaism differently. Mostly, this is just a second, as is the case with many books of the Apocrypha, this is a chance to say, the set of books that we have is chosen by certain groups of Jews historically. And there's a chance for us to actually look at the contributions of groups of Jews that are not European, that are not so much rabbinic, tied to, communities of rabbis. And we can actually say that Judaism is not just the ones that sort of won historically and became most prominent. We ourselves can recenter, reestablish forms of Jewish text, including the book of Jubilees, that have mattered for a long time, but haven't mattered to the communities that have been amplified most. So we're going to close out there. And the last thing that I'll say as we close out is, please, we've now had a few of these mini episodes. Send us your questions, your hot takes, your thoughts, your books that you want to read as part of your recanonized, decanonized Hanukkah experience. Let us know. Dan@JudaismUnbound.com, Lex@JudaismUnbound.com, the Torah Studio @gmail.com for Liana. We're really excited to keep this conversation going. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.